Hmm. I am a really good person. Oh, welcome everyone to Module 4, Lecture 10 for Introduction to International Relations. We're continuing our discussion of foreign policy, and so today we're going to be talking about Robert Putnam's article, Diplomacy and Domestic Politics, the Logic of Two-Level Games. So we've talked a lot about how, on the one hand, there's all these dynamics going on at the international level, right? How states interact with one another. But it's also important to realize that the people who are making these decisions are not existing in a vacuum. They have people that they represent back at home in their home countries. There are constituents, there are interest groups, as we talked about last lecture. So it's important to acknowledge the fact that any kind of foreign policy decision making occurs in a space where there are both considerations at the international level as well as the domestic level, and they interact oftentimes. So we've looked long ago now at the different theories of international relations, and remember, neo-realism and neoliberalism tend to treat the state as a unitary actor in the international system. It's the most important unit of analysis, but in reality, it's not the only one, and that's a really important thing to recognize as we move forward. So in reality, there are conditions which may frustrate the idea that the state is really the most important actor. At the domestic level, as I mentioned a moment ago, you have groups that pursue their own interests by pressuring the governments while politicians seek to assemble coalitions. So these politicians are beholden to the constituents that elected them. They are supported by various groups that have lobbying power and financial resources that they can bring to bear on election cycles. So there's a lot of politics going on at the domestic level before we even begin to talk about what happens between states at the international level. And at this international level, governments seek to satisfy domestic groups while minimizing negative consequences of foreign developments. So they have to deal with both the groups back home that care a great deal about what they're doing, as well as those that they are currently dialoguing with and negotiating with at the international level. And so national leaders have to kind of move between both of these spaces, which make their jobs particularly difficult and challenging at times. And to complicate matters even further, what might be rational behavior at one level might not be rational once we get to a different level. And it could be vice versa, right? It could be domestic or international. So a concept that's related to this is known as win sets. And there are, in the concept of win sets, there are two stages at which negotiations take place. At the first level, you have discussions between the negotiators about the issue at hand, whether it's international trade or climate change or humanitarian intervention or foreign assistance. Lots of different kinds of issues could be discussed at this point. And so this bargaining occurs between these negotiators representing their respective countries, and it leads to a tentative agreement, right? They've hashed it out and they figured out what are the elements that could be supported by both or even more member countries. Then at the second level, there are separate discussions with each group of constituents about whether or not they want to ratify the agreement. And we've seen this, right, time and time again here in the United States, where there's discussion at the international level about some kind of issue, whether it's limiting Iran's nuclear capabilities or the Paris Climate Agreement. And then there's these domestic discussions about, is this feasible within our legal infrastructure? Is this something that we want to sign on to? Does it represent the interests of the American people, of the interest groups that have a powerful sway over the ways in which policy is directed? So you need buy-in from these individual groups in order to assess whether the tentative agreement that was reached in level 1 is going to ultimately lead to ratification, which is what you'll likely need if you want to proceed with an international treaty. Although, as we've seen in the case of the Obama administration, where it is recognized that perhaps Congress might be intransigent and won't deal with any kinds of international treaties, it's possible that the executive may choose to circumvent or find other alternative routes to achieving these goals. But the problem, of course, is this seems to detract from the democratic legitimacy of those kinds of decisions, right? Because you want to be able to have Congress sign on to something, ideally, given that it would represent these different interest groups and different constituents who have all been able to contribute to a discussion about whether this is something that should be signed, and then it gets the approval of or the consent of the Senate, and that's how treaties are passed, right? So that is the way that's probably preferable within a democratic setting, but as we've seen, domestic politics can be very messy, and it can lead to tensions between the executive and legislative branches, and then it's less clear about how we should proceed, given that there are international issues which are important to address, but if at the domestic level it appears that there isn't going to be any kind of demonstrable progress, what is a president supposed to do in that situation? And that's a question that gets hashed out time and time again throughout different administrations. And so the win set concept in particular refers to the set of all possible agreements that would gain the necessary majority among constituents when voted up or down. So just looking at this from a very hypothetical standpoint, say you have 4 different agreements, and say agreement number 1 gives the United States not enough cachet for what it's investing in. Say the United States is going to be largely left out of the administration of some kind of treaty, and most of the effort is going to be implemented by another country. And so the U.S. is going to feel kind of shortchanged. And maybe Agreement 4 is a situation in which the United States is responsible for, say, most of the funding of some kind of international effort, and it could put a strain on the American economy if it gets kind of out of hand. So it might not be that favorable because it puts the onus perhaps too greatly on the United States to make up for the other country or countries that are not contributing as much in terms of financial or military resources. However, Agreements 2 and 3 achieve a more equitable balance between the resources that need to be marshaled in order to address an international issue. So we might refer to Agreements 2 and 3 as the win sets because they're going to be more politically palatable. They're going to be more likely to achieve that majority among the constituents who are ultimately going to be the ones that will cast a vote on whether or not they want an agreement to pass. So if you are the elected official, or say the president or the prime minister, and you are thinking about what is likely to be passed as opposed to what is likely to achieve the best goal. Remember, we talked in the previous lecture about satisficing and optimizing. Well, in a win set kind of situation, you're likely to have to satisfice as opposed to optimize because you're going to have to deal with lots of different groups and you won't be able to satisfy all of them. So you have to go with an option that's going to kind of cross that minimum threshold to get you beyond the point at which it's going to be acceptable for a large enough group of people. So what are the factors that contribute to whether a win set is going to be successful at garnering enough votes? And in general, what are the different factors that we should think about when comparing different options within the win set? So first, you have to look at the distribution of power, preferences, and possible coalitions among level 2 constituents. Remember, those level 2 constituents are the groups operating at the domestic level who, for one reason or another, care a great deal about the outcome of an international negotiation. So these are some of the factors, initially speaking, that are important to consider when evaluating which of the possible options are likely to gain enough vote to pass. Second, you've got level 2 political institutions, and these are, for example, like your legislatures, your government agencies, all of the sort of governmental structures back at home at the domestic level that will also likely have something to say about the issue because it may affect them and the way that they conduct the governing capacity that they are charged with enacting. Another thing that you'll have to think about are the strategies themselves of the level 1 negotiators. So and this obviously gets even more complicated when you have more than, say, 2 countries, right? It grows in a large sense, and you have to consider all of the relevant actors that are in play here. what is it that the other negotiators want to achieve for their countries? Will they be likely to shortchange their own countries or the interests of their constituents, or are they likely to take a more hardline stance? So you can't only think about what is it that I want to get out of the negotiation. You have to also examine what is it that my, in some cases, opponents or the other parties to this negotiation want to achieve, and how can I anticipate that in a way that allows me to kind of craft my position in such a way that it might be amenable to the circumstances and opportunities of the other negotiators representing other countries. So an example of this is this one might be very useful to talk about, and that is recently concluded nuclear negotiations with Iran and several other countries. So what happened was Iran signed an agreement with the United States and 6 other countries regarding the future of its nuclear program. The United States wanted to halt the expansion of Iran's nuclear program as a way of protecting what they deemed as national and international security. Iran, on the other hand, wanted to continue to develop its nuclear program for reasons related to energy independence, prestige, and security. One really important issue here, which hopefully it's kind of buzzing in the back of your mind, is this concept of sovereignty that we've talked about several times now. So the United States wants to preserve its own sovereignty. It doesn't want to have to worry about perhaps Iran's nuclear ambitions resulting in the firing of nuclear weapons, either on the United States or its allies, and so that could cause an affront to its sovereignty. And on the other hand, from Iran's perspective, who are other countries to tell Iran what to do with its own nuclear program? That falls under the purview of its own state sovereignty. So you've got these kind of competing issues all wrapped around the issue of state sovereignty that, if you can look at it from 2 different perspectives, are certainly important to understanding why this would be a very complex issue to try and negotiate. So what I want you to do as a kind of think piece to leave you with is to read over the article that's attached in Module 4 in the New York Times called "Who Got What They Wanted in the Iran Nuclear Deal?" And I want you to pay attention to a couple of things in particular as you read through that article. First, how did domestic politics and international politics complicate the negotiations? We've got the international politics, right, which is going to be the United States and the other 6 countries. And then you've got a lot of domestic discourse within these countries, especially the United States, whether we're talking about Persian Americans or the American-Israeli lobby, the national security interest groups, the military-industrial complex, the foreign policy establishment. So how did these 2 things intersect as it was described in the article? And then also, now that we have this agreement in place, do you think that this was a good outcome? Was it good for Iran in limiting their nuclear capacity in the future? Was it good for the United States? Is this something that the United States can be proud of in terms of its negotiating capacity and point to this as an example of successful diplomacy? So these are just a couple things I want you to think about as you read through the article as we wrap up this segment on foreign policy.